Okay, I believe we're live. Hi everyone, Alan Schimmel, DevOps.com, here for another great webinar. This one sponsored by our friends at XebiaLabs, and today's webinar is on lessons learned, scaling DevOps and CD for the enterprise. It's going to be a little different than some of our other webinars in that this is going to be an interactive panel discussion with what I think we've ever had on a webinar. And you should see their smiling faces as we're going through here. Before we start our webinar, though, I wanted to just do a little bit of housekeeping, and that includes going over our agenda. The next slide, if I can ask my back engineers to move one slide forward. There we go to an agenda. Oop. And of course, it went too far. Our agenda today is we're going to be handling housekeeping, quick introductions, and then we're going to get right into our topic, which is scaling DevOps for the enterprise. And at the end, all of our panel members have been kind enough to give us some resources which we'll make available to you, which can help you dig a little deeper and a little further into today's topic. And of course, we've left time for audience participation with Q&A. Speaking of audience participation with Q&A, let me just quickly go over a little housekeeping. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, both audio and video, slides, the whole recording, resources, everything will be available within 24 to 48 hours on DevOps.com. You can pose questions to our organizers within your GoToWebinar control panel. If you'll notice, there is a section called Questions. And if you hit the little caret there, it'll expand, and you can ask your question in there. I see someone had said they can't hear anything, but I assume that was older, and you're hearing it now. But the nice thing about having this question section is you don't have to wait till the questions part of the webinar to type in your question. If you're like me, you may forget it by then. You can type your question in at any time, and we will save it and queue it for the appropriate time in the webinar. There's also a chat session down at the bottom. If you're having technical difficulties, that's probably the best place to reach our web engineers and straighten that out. With that being said, again, Alan Schimmel, DevOps.com. Welcome, and we are going to get started. We'll start off by, of course, introducing our webinar participants here today. They're waving. In door number one to my right is none other than esteemed researcher, best-selling author, about to have a new book out, I hope soon, Gene Kim. Gene, welcome.
Alan, great to be with you.
I can repeat. No pressure, Gene, no pressure. And then last but certainly not least is actually a favorite of mine who I've now seen present a few times at a couple of DevOps conferences, including the DevOps Enterprise Summit this past November in San Francisco, from Capital One, Topo. Topo, welcome so much, and thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and Happy New Year to you all.
Okay. That being said, let's dive in, guys. I've had my 5 minutes of fame, and let's talk about. Whoop, I'm sorry, I'm having a little difficulty here. My apologies. Scaling DevOps and CD for the enterprise. Andrew, why don't you frame the topic here for our audience?
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, I mean, let me try and keep this short and sweet. I think everybody who's joined today is going to be interested in this particular topic, just given the title. I think what I'm really looking forward to in this discussion is being able to talk about what happens when you go beyond the Tiger team, you know, the 6 kids in a college dorm with a bunch of servers on Amazon. I think we've all, you know, we've seen a lot of very creative and innovative stuff happen in the DevOps space, and it's grown tremendously and significantly, and we're getting to a point, of course, where organizations are seeing lots and lots of activity happening. within their teams. Large organizations want to benefit from this kind of this tremendous like upshift in innovation and capability as well. But obviously, if you're working in a large organization, depending on the industry you're in, there are other external forces such as regulatory constraints and so on. There are some things you need to take into account that maybe weren't initially part of the kind of DevOps 101 story simply because they didn't apply in that particular area. And I think what we're trying to do now is to share the kind of knowledge that is necessary so that the people or the companies that are trying to adopt DevOps now, it's on your agenda for 2016, or maybe you've already got started, they don't get stuck making the same mistakes and learning the same lessons as the forerunners, people like Topo and others. Gene has written extensively about them, that have started to tread this path and that can share a lot of their experience and insight. And I think some of the classic topics, like the discussions I have day in, day out about these things, are things like, okay, yeah, but how do I scale the knowledge that's required to do DevOps across different teams, especially when I'm a large organization with a very diverse set of team members with different levels of skills, different levels of experience. Gene has, and I remember the quote, dev.star ops. We've seen, I think it's been a big theme that the discussion has gone beyond just development and operations to include a lot of other groups that naturally need to be at the table, especially in the enterprise setup, people like security and testing and the business and project management and so on. And I think the interface is much less well-defined there. There's a lot more work to be done to have a best practice in that area. And then, of course, one of the great things about DevOps as a bottom-up initiative is that motivated, talented people have been able to do a lot of this kind of skunkworks style by using a lot of the great open source tooling that's out there, by leveraging a lot of the free resources in terms of experience. But at a certain point, yes, you will need a project budget. You will need a project organization. You're going to have some top-down air cover to bash through that one manager or team that just simply doesn't want to listen. And how do you build the business case? How do you make that statement that this is really something good for your organization to do, even if you're not an Etsy or a Facebook or one of these unicorn organizations that, whilst they're very impressive, typically your business doesn't look very much like their business to some extent. I mean, okay, I don't want to go on about this too much longer. I think that's what we're here to discuss today. What can we learn about doing this in the real world, where the real world is the real world of the enterprise? And now for me to step back and hand it over to some extent to the experts, and let's hear what they have to say.
Okay. Well, Andrew, I always considered you an expert as well, but we have a great panel of experts. Here's our first question, though, for you. And we're going to ask Topo to lead it off, but it is, what have been some of the top challenges to implementing DevOps in large, complex environments, and how did you overcome them?
Andrew, thanks for the good introduction, which kind of leads into what I'm going to talk about here in terms of the biggest challenges that I faced in implementing DevOps in a large enterprise, and which happens to be a bank too. The first is fear of failure. So when I started, there was a lot of pessimism around whether it's going to be successful or what kind of business values that we are going to get out of it. Is it going to add to any business value that actually customers see, and all kinds of negativity around that. The way to correct that is, again, find a tiger team and make them successful, or try to create new patterns within few tiger teams, and then kind of go out in the enterprise and talk about it and demonstrate what you have achieved, and encourage other teams to become tiger teams. And that way you kind of scale. And once you show the business value and prove that this is going to work, then you get good support from people higher up, and then it becomes from top to bottom rather than purely from bottom up. And I think that's a good mix. So the first step is start small, take one step at a time, be successful, demonstrate, build out the story, prove it, and then get top level support, and then it becomes easier for you. You want to add anything, Jane, to it, or Andrew?
Gene?
Oh, this is great. In fact, I can't wait to hear your next one, Topo. Is your second one about legacy processes?
Yeah. So around legacy processes, what I found is that in big enterprises that traditionally ran waterfall for a long time, there are legacy processes defined and documented and handed over to various teams, and the teams were supposed to follow them. But if you go back and ask actual people who wrote it, first of all, you probably cannot find them. And number two, even if you find them, some of the things that people talk about to be done in a big enterprise are not really true. They are kind of myths. Saying that the developers cannot build their software is one of such kind of myth, where separation of duty, for example, was kind of taken to an extreme, saying that if you have coded, not only you cannot deploy the software yourself, but also you cannot even build that software. So there are myths around all these legacy processes, and I think they will be unique to a given enterprise. So you need to kind of poke around and have the courage and executive support to even ask, what does this mean, and why should I do it, and what value does this add? And if you poke around, you'll see that a lot of these myths and legacy processes, quote unquote, kind of go away on the side, making the path a little more clearer.
Actually, so when you were asking me whether I had a comment, I was actually looking for this quote that you had from 2014 in your talk. I wrote it down. I was just looking for the exact quoting. You said around this mythical processes, you said auditors, they keep asking about fictitious processes we don't have, as if they were Kaiser Soze from that movie, The Usual Suspects, which I thought was incredible. I mean, and because I think we've done things in certain ways for so long, right? We've trained auditors to essentially rely on controls that aren't the only way to achieve the control objective.
Right. And the third biggest challenge is, of course, bureaucracy and the walls of separation. I mean, from the developer's point of view, when it is ready to test, and huge document is to be sent to the test team for approval and all that. So that's one of the challenges, to get a true DevOps implemented. You need to have those walls of separation move away, or at least be not known.
Excellent. Andrew, anything to add?
I think these are all points that resonate very much with the kind of those organizations that are doing this well that we work with are doing a lot of these things. I think one of the kind of, well, I'm always surprised about the walls because, of course, and we've been through this as an industry, cycles of outsourcing and these kind of things. Yes, if you're working with people who are very distant, who you have very little contact to and so on, you need some kind of documented handover mechanism. But in a lot of organizations, we've come back, we're doing actually a lot of the development and the testing in-house. There is really no need to have a very, very document-heavy process. And it's not just the documentation, it's also we're cutting the human out of the interaction for no real benefit, other than maybe at some point it was required. So I think this cuts back into the legacy processes that Topo was talking about. Software is a largely ill-defined to some extent. It's not like building a bridge. There are many, many open questions, many nuances about understanding. In order to build the best software for the customer, which is what we're trying to do, all the people who are at the table should be communicating as effectively as possible. So yes, let's cut out as much of that, because every time you put something on paper, stuff gets lost. We know that. It's not software specific. So if we can get rid of some of that, then we're really helping ourselves think smartly about what we're delivering.
Excellent. Guys, I think we're going to go on to the next question then.
Actually, Alan, one of the things that, in terms of top challenges, one of the things that we had every speaker at the DevOps Enterprise Summit 2014 do was end with a slide with one of two titles. Here's what I don't know how to do, or here's what I'm looking for help with. And that really framed the agenda for the 2015 conference. And so in 2014, the top challenges were 5 things. One was cultural change. How do we what are transition aids for that? 2 was automated testing. 3 was security and compliance. 4 was roles and responsibilities. And 5 was metrics for DevOps improvement programs. So coming out of the 50 speakers from DevOps Enterprise 2015, we ended up with a kind of a very interesting list. That looks quite a bit different. The first one was, how do you build a culture that values collaboration and technical excellence? I think I just love the quote from Richard, from the CEO of Kappa One that Topo sent me. It was just astonishing. He said, Richard Fairbank says, we need to become a world-class technology organization, and so I think that's so much of I think what is required is to value the technology team. The second one was very much like last year. How do I accelerate and expand adoption throughout my organization? A third, there was actually a more nuanced question, which is how do I get my senior leadership on board, especially for the stodgy, more conservative folks, because I think what they're verbalizing is they are essentially obstacles to get from here, where we are, to where we need to go. There were two other ones that I thought were very interesting. One was how do I get started and how do I finish my first win? How do I create and finish my first win, especially with limited time and resources? So given all the budgetary pressures, time pressures, how do you pull off your first success, as Topo was mentioning, right? How do you create that as target teams and actually enable them to succeed? I think what they're verbalizing is they have conceptual buy-in, but now essentially they need to take that risk and make that first success. The fourth one really surprised me, but it makes a lot of sense. Essentially, what the problem was: how do I take what I'm hearing at this DevOps Enterprise Summit and bring it back to my organization and convert them? So I think that's what's saying is that at the conference for 2 years now, we have a population of believers. How do we get everyone else on board? And then again, metrics came up. Does that resonate with you guys? Andrew, Topo, you were there at the conference as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And actually, Gene, we've already started getting comments from the audience, and one of them happened to be was, I don't think upper management knows what DevOps is. How can we sell DevOps to them?
Yeah.
And that is a common question. I think that was heard at DevOps Enterprise, as well as in general we hear that.
And one quick comment on that. I mean, I think we had specifically written the Phoenix project to the primary audience was technology leadership, but one of the points in the book was really that every goal that the company was trying to achieve, whether it was strategy, normal business operations, integrity of financial reporting and compliance with laws and regulations, all of those are being jeopardized by the technology organization. And so it was really trying to make the point: every company needs to be a technology company, regardless of what industry that we're operating. Something that Richard Fairbank from Capital One was saying is that the winners in every segment of the marketplace is going to be enabled by software. So, I think the Phoenix project was specifically designed to help tell that story.
Sure.
Yeah.
Guys, Andrew, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, move on if we have to, but I think Gene is absolutely right. And Topo, I know Capital One has done a lot of work on this internally as well. Drawing the connection between DevOps, whatever that may mean to an executive, and company-relevant goals. Gene said this exactly, right? We know the people who are doing it and experiencing it, that there is a direct link between pretty much every goal that is always on the CIO's or CEO's sheet and something that can be affected by DevOps. But that doesn't mean that you have to go to the CEO and say, DevOps is the thing we need to do. You just need to help them understand how this thing that you're going to do is going to relate to their goals. And then, of course, you have to go and prove it to them and show it to them as well.
Excellent. Guys, we're going to need to move on if we're going to cover our agenda. So I'm going to stop that one right there and move to my next question, which is, what was your most valuable enterprise DevOps implementation lesson in 2015? And I think we're going to start this one off with Gene.
Well, there are three that really struck out for me, that stood out for me. One was actually hearing from Jason Cox from his title is the Director of Systems Engineering at Disney. So essentially his job is to embed ops engineers across product teams across the Disney enterprise, as well as owning all of the operations and service support for middleware and so forth. But to hear about his funding model of how essentially he is his 100 plus systems engineers, ops engineers are being paid for by the lines of business, and so they retain a very functional orientation. And what I just learned very recently from Tom Limoncelli is that Google also retains a functional orientation. In other words, they don't really have ops people living in the dev teams. The 1,000 site reliability engineers at Google all report to a VP of SREs. So there's 1,000 people in that organization, and just like Disney, all of the budget for the SREs are coming from the product teams. And in fact, the competition for SRE resources are so fierce that you have only a finite number of business units who are actually eligible to get SREs. The rest of them have to self-manage. The product teams have to self-manage their own code in production. So I think this notion of functional orientation, I think, is far more prominent, and so that was a really huge learning for me. The second one was came from Mike Bland, who described how the testing culture got built at Google. So he was there in 2005 when deploying to the home page, the google.com homepage, was a very dangerous activity that was prone to taking down search, delaying search and so forth. And one of the things that impeded a test-driven culture was because everyone was so metrics-driven. In other words, you can't prove a negative, and so when you have everyone really caring about metrics, it's very difficult to substantiate a business case for increased testing. And I thought that was a very interesting insight, and to have the story told about how they went from this dangerous activity where people were afraid to push changes out to one where they're doing tens of thousands of code commits into the repo, hundreds of thousands of builds per day. I mean, it was just an amazing story. And the third actually came from Topo's presentation about the intrinsic value for people who are taking part in a DevOps transformation. There was a story about the gentleman who was trying to find a internal counsel, a lawyer, right, to help sort of revise the Capital One open source policy, and for him to essentially go door to door trying to find a lawyer who would be willing to take up this cause. I've never, I think that for me set a new level of like what the motivation is and what we're willing to do, to improve the state of the organization. So those are some of my favorite learnings.
Sure. Andrew, do you have others you'd like to add or comment on Gene's?
No,
Andrew,
I think we'll touch on this a few times. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you now.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. I think, we'll touch on these a few times. I think the first point that Gene mentioned is indeed fascinating, and I think part of the enterprise reality is there's no one model to rule them all. As Gene said, even within Google, there's some teams that have to do with self-management, and there's others where there is value in specialization for certain things, coupled with a very clearly defined interface. And I think one of the things to remember about DevOps or similar kind of concepts as well is that shared understanding, shared knowledge, collaboration doesn't necessarily have to mean you all sit around the same table, right? So there are many ways of making sure you understand and you get more of an end-to-end picture of things. And I think the other one about testing is also very interesting because, I mean, testing still to a large extent, Gene was mentioning it in one of the highlights, or what we still need to fix for DO's 2014. Quality is a really difficult one because it's always been a very unglamorous thing to do. Certainly, if you look at most of the resumes of the people who are now going for DevOps jobs, they'll talk about their automation experience and capability and the latest provisioning tools or whatever. Automated testing, it's not. I just think we still have a way to go before we accord it the kind of level of importance that it really has. Because frankly, in my view, and it's our day job, building continuous delivery pipelines or helping companies do that. What's the value of a beautiful pipeline if you have no idea what is going through it? Could be raw sewage for all you know, right? That's not particularly useful. So quality measurement is very, very important. I think we have some way to go there, as Gene said, because you can't prove it's perfect. All you can do is to try to raise your confidence level, and that's a very hard thing to grasp in metrics. But I think, we can do some, go on forever, let me stop there. Let's see, Topo. Any thoughts from you?
Fair enough, Topo.
I'll share the same thoughts. I'll just add and ask the audience to actually go and look up the presentation by Ticketmaster in the DevOps Enterprise. That was an awesome presentation. I think it's a must-watch for me.
Yes. And
why? What struck out?
Scale,
why is that a must?
Yeah, the scale and the passion that they talked about was kind of awesome. It's a good learning point for me.
Actually, just to resonate with that, there was one of my favorite lines out of the whole conference when he said, as ops, given his background, he said the metaphor of ops is dev is ops. No, sorry, dev is offense, and their job is to score goals, and ops is defense, right? And he realized that metaphor might actually be exacerbating the dev versus ops thing. And he said, a better metaphor is, was it that ops is the ops was actually the offensive lineman, right? Basically their job is to protect the other players so that they can actually have time to throw the ball. I thought that was such a fascinating insight.
Yep. One of many great ones that does this year. But we're going to move on to our next question, folks. And here it is. And I think, Andrew, we're going to ask you to start this one off, but what were the biggest new categories, challenges, or surprises of 2015?
Well, I mean, I think Gene did an admirable job of summarizing some of them just a second ago, and I think for me, well, one of the things that I think we're seeing, so the good thing is that we're now, the names that are talking about DevOps and how they're doing it are really large scale. I think a year ago or so you could have just about got away with saying, yes, well, but there's nobody in my industry that does it. The only companies who do are the companies that are like, well, we're not in the retail business or whatever. Now, pretty much that excuse is off the table. It doesn't matter which industry you're in. There's some highly successful story that's doing this kind of stuff. And I think that's reflected obviously in the amount of growth. If you look on LinkedIn or people searching for DevOps, jobs, I mean, of course, it's always a difficult one, certainly for people who've been in the field for a while, because I think most of us feel that it's not a job title, right? It's an attitude. So what your job title is, you're an automation engineer or you're a cultural ambassador or whatever, but you're not a DevOps person, because that's just creating another silo, and the whole point is to get rid of silos. And I think that the last one is really the interesting one. For me, I sort of, in my head, I look at it a little bit like we're seeing that there is sort of a level 1 DevOps, if you like, and then there's a level 2 DevOps. And your level 1 is what where a lot of the quick wins come from, putting in place some of the basic quote-unquote automation. Not that that's easy, but it's relatively well understood what needs to be done there. And I think, as Gene said, level 2, and I was having a discussion actually at the DevOps Enterprise Summit with someone from Netflix about this, is leveraging the capability that this tooling gives you to become a different type of organization, largely a more experimental organization, an organization that understands that the only way to be truly successful in this market is not to believe that if you just sit in the planning room long and hard enough, you can get everything right up front, because we know that that's not true. But that obviously requires an enormous mentality shift to understand that our job is really to use the capability that we have to try stuff, and some of it won't work, and then we have to get rid of it and we have to replace it with other stuff. But there's a sort of level of humility almost there of understanding that really the only person who knows is the customer, and not some high guru up in product management or whatever. And I think that kind of cultural change, which I think the people within Dev and Ops, they get this, but that's where it starts to bleed into organizational culture that is way beyond the technical level. And I think, yeah, going from the level 1 bit, like we have provisioning and deployment automation and the continuous delivery pipeline, to let's use this as a cultural change implement, that's still tough.
Excellent. Topo, any follow-on to that?
Yeah, so I'll kind of connect the two top bullet points here, which is one of the surprises was that DevOps now mainstream. I think it happened a little too quick for a good reason, and that relates to the second one, which is DevOps in a job title. Now, it is so mainstream these days that when you say see a DevOps job posting on popular job posting sites, somehow people know what they're looking for. And people do apply. So, DevOps is so wide, starting from continuous integration, test automation, infrastructure as code, all the whole thing from start to end. And when you actually post a job and people apply to it, apparently there's an understanding as what the job requires and what the applicant has in their skill set bucket. So that's kind of very surprising and amazing to me. And as far as the culture changes go, yes, and I think we are seeing more developers taking ownership of their development activity and kind of innovating on that, and they are free to do so with the support of senior executives, which is a good thing.
Gene, if you don't mind, before you jump in, Topo, I happened to see a funny T-shirt at a conference I was at recently, and it said sysadmin, because even developers need heroes. And I wonder, I wonder how you feel about that, with developers taking, more of a leadership role in these things.
Yeah, I mean, today's with today's tools and things that are available in open source or commercial market, actually developers can do a lot of things that previously they could not. And thanks to the tools vendors, and it gives you a big head start into the ops kind of activities. Even though you are a developer, you can still do some of the basic ops kind of activities without actually going to the ops, which is an awesome thing.
Gene, I didn't give you a chance to comment on this whole slide.
No, I was just tweeting out, trying to tweet out that quote. That is awesome, sysadmins, because you developers need heroes. In fact, Mark Imbriaco, he was the VP of Operations at GitHub, at 37 Signals, at Heroku. He said, when you have developers, trying to configure servers, it's just not a very good sign of productivity, right? And so he's a developer by background, and I think he would definitely agree with that. I think for me, one of my big late understandings, especially as we're trying to wrap up the DevOps Handbook, which is definitely coming out later this year, is that there's this incredible convergence of the schools of thinking, whether it's high reliability organizations, whether it's safety culture by Dr. Sidney Decker, whether it's high trust management style, servant leadership, whether it's the Senge work around learning organizations. I mean, when I look at the DevOps, especially in the enterprise success stories, I think we are drawing so much of the work that has been, I think, primarily academic, or it's been in industry, but it's been sort of at the margins, like Zappos or the A.L. Gore or Johnson Sausage Factory. I mean, now it's mainstream companies, and so I think it's so exciting that that in combination with the Toyota Production System and Lean, I think it really is defining the next generation of management style. I mean, I think most people will agree. Command and control management styles won't get us from here to there, but no one really knows what to replace it with. And I think the boundaries of the management techniques that are being used and described in the DevOps community is what is going to replace command and control. So that I think is so exciting, and that's that happens once in a generation.
Yeah, I think we are in that generational kind of KT boundary zone. Okay, excuse me, folks. I'd like to move on to our next question, if it's okay then. And that is, what do you see as the trends, common goals, and obstacles for 2016 being? What are the big stories for 2016? And Topo, if it's okay, we'll start off with you.
Yeah, I think DevOps, as I said, DevOps is now kind of mainstream now, and I think it will become more part of core competency for any mainstream IT shop. And people are talking about DevOps all the way. And we have seen in DOS 15, the participation level was at least doubled. Gene, correct me if I'm wrong. And I think next year it will be, I don't know, triple maybe. So that's one of the things that I expect to happen. Next thing is more focus on cloud and infrastructure as code. And main reason is if you follow the DevOps pipeline from continuous integration to test automation to deployment, at each and every step, you will actually find some bottleneck to go to the next step. And I think this cloud and infrastructure as code is going to be the next set of bottlenecks that people want to solve to actually go into continuous delivery mode. So that will get more focus in 2016. And to do that, as I said, automation tools are very useful and they'll become more important. And if you look at XebiaLabs DevOps tools periodic table, you'll know what I'm talking about. I think there'll be more tools on there. So you may need to have a new look at the periodic table and make it bigger. So those are my three trends or kind of prediction, if you will.
Interesting. Gene, how about you?
Yeah, I'm super excited about the translating these early success. Well, I actually let me predicate on the other ones. I think I did a calculation that 30 to 40% of the presenters at DevOps Enterprise 2014 were promoted, which is just and by the way, that's assuming, Topo, that you count your change in role as a promotion. Maybe it's a demotion. I never asked. It's a little awkward, but yeah, I think that's the one. I think that's a way of one interpretation is that the value that they're creating is being recognized by the organization in terms of the value they're creating, and they're being tasked with expanding that across the organization to help elevate the state of the practice. So I am just so excited by that, and I'm hoping that continues. And I guess it's also kind of confirming this. For me, the inevitable trajectory of that is pretty obvious. I mean, I think these people who are driving DevOps transformations are not only can span boundaries like dev, test, operations, information security, but they have such a great understanding of the business goals of the organization that there's no doubt in my mind that this population of people are going to be the business leaders over the next decade. So that to me is super exciting.
Absolutely. Andrew, how about you?
Just a couple more to throw into the ring there, apart from like trying to figure out how we can fit the double-sized periodic table of elements on the wall here. But no, I think one of the things that is interesting, and it goes a little bit hand in hand with what Topo was saying about automation tools becoming more important and this growth within an organization. We really want to find a way, especially in larger organizations, as Gene was also touching on information security, those kind of angles, making that as easy as possible, like not have that debate over and over again. Oh, how does this work with our compliance, blah, blah, blah. And I think part of the challenge there, of course, is like we don't want to stifle the innovation, yet we want to check the boxes, and of course, ultimately, we want to get rid of the boxes. I think Topo was absolutely right. A lot of the processes that we have in place don't necessarily are not fit for purpose in a modern environment, but they're still there. So you have to have this transitionary phase where you get rid of them, but first you want to like make sure you don't have to bash your head against that wall for so long. And I think one of the things we're seeing is that in order to make that possible, we need to think of the work we're doing as being a combination of automation, which is obvious, but then also visibility and control. I know Capital One has done quite a lot of work in that area, specifically around visibility, like understanding what is going on. Because for a lot of the organization, DevOps can still be a magic black box. It's a very useful black box for sure, because great stuff happens in there. But that that also creates some of the fear, some of the pessimism, some of the I'm not so sure what this thing is going to do. So if we can open up some windows into this in a very easy way, comparatively easy, I think we're in a great position. Potential hurdle just go away. And I think as Jim was actually here, able to do IT in a really modern way is actually a way of engaging. It's a customer thing. It's not just an internal technical thing. It's a business change. So this population of people will be at the forefront of revolutionizing your business. And as Topo was saying, the key there is make sure the people that are writing the features understand what the features are for. I mean, I as a developer, I worked on plenty of teams where you got like a requirement in, and you wrote some code, and that was it. And who used it, why it was written, or what exactly was behind it, not just you didn't know, but it probably didn't even care to ask. And I think we're putting ourselves in a position where this can radically change, and that's great.
Sure. Andrew, you said something there about the modern way IT gets done. And to me, that is a great segue into our next question. And it's maybe a little bit of a longer-term look than our previous one, which is what does DevOps and CD and these technologies look like in 3 to 5 years? Some people get very hung up on a very structured, rigid definition of DevOps, and other people, almost Andrew, I've heard it said, it's the new way things get done. It's the new way IT gets done. It's almost an umbrella for so many of these technologies, CI/CD and so forth. What about in 3 to 5 years? Do we still call this DevOps, or is it something else? I mean, and it takes a little bit of crystal ball gazing. So, Topo, if you have your crystal ball out, I'm going to let you go first and give us what you think, a little longer, a little bit further out.
So, yeah, I don't know. I have no idea whether it will be still called DevOps or CD or something, but I'm sure it will have something to do with Dev and Ops together. Whether they call it A, B, or C, it really doesn't matter. So that's about what term we use 3 to 5 years from now. And about tools and technologies, I think, and I'm seeing the notion of it in the market in terms of tools, that 3 to 5 years from now, developers can actually come into an organization and on the first day make a commit that goes out to production.
That would be great. We'll come back to that in 3 to 5 years, hopefully.
Good.
What about Gene?
Actually, Topo, did you say, well, if the prediction is that people can actually go into organizations and do a commit on the first day, right? I mean, that's the goal that has been in place at Etsy, for many years. Right now, people first day, they say board members deploy code, dogs deploy code. And it's a really an amazing article. I'll send out the link to that. I think I agree with Topo, right? I think DevOps will be just the way that we do technology work, and there's just no doubt in my mind that technology work is increasingly how value is created in any organization. That's how we acquire customers. That's how we deliver deliver value to the customers. I just sent two links out. I think the best kind of the academic treatment of this topic. One is by hang on. Her name is Carlotta Perez, which is recommended. This book was recommended to me by a good friend, Chris Little, and she's a professor at Oxford University. And essentially, it's an amazing book. She wrote a book called Technology, Revolutions, and Financial Capital. But I think the big takeaway is that the best years are ahead of us. One of the things that she predicts that in the 5 macroeconomic trends that have happened over the last 250 years is that the big shift happens when innovation is created with not financial capital, but with production capital. So I guess my interpretation of this is that previously the DevOps innovations have really come from these kind of unicorns. It was Google, Amazon, Netflix, and so forth. But increasingly, I think what the DevOps enterprise community represents is taking the same techniques, and now the largest brands in every industry verticals are adopting those techniques. And there's just no doubt that that's where the majority of value is going to get created. The other graph I sent out was this link that really shows the link between the electrification that happened over 60 years, starting in 1890, with the same curve of the adoption of information technology. And I think what this suggests is that we're just at the beginning, right? The real value is going to be created over the next 30 years, and so I think that's super, super exciting.
It's almost scary to think, though, that we're just at the beginning for the real value.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd love to be there and see what that looks like. Andrew, what about you?
Just polish my crystal mug and take a very
I thought you were reading tea leaves in there, yeah.
I mean, I think 3 to 5 years, as Gene said, is both an incredibly long time, but of course, we know that the market or the scope of companies and organizations that use IT is enormous. So I think there will definitely still be people running mainframes for whom this doesn't really, this isn't necessarily what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. I think what we are going to see is that there's going to be the spread, I think, is going to be bigger. I think it's going to be very difficult to find an organization that you would regard as market-leading or that is delivering market-leading features or functionality that is not doing this. Because just the difference in what you're able to achieve versus other people is just so tremendous. I think what we're going to see, there's still going to be a bunch of people involved in it, but the people who are at the forefront of this, I guess it'll be the status quo almost. They'll be innovating the next level, and as Topo said, who knows what that's going to be called. I think they will be looking at DevOps potentially even as a phase that they went through to get to where they are then. I mean, I think we have some very interesting things coming up, which is a sort of a continued merger, if you like, of development and operations, in the sense that the last big step change we had technologically was to go from physical stuff where your servers ran to virtual stuff, and that brought the scope of pretty much everything into the developer's domain, because it meant that you could code up a server, which was not possible before then. You had to actually build a server. But I think what we're seeing now is that, with things like containerization and Amazon Lambda and various other things, is that we are moving into an incredibly reactive model of operations. We're no longer, virtual machines, you're still talking minutes potentially to get stuff done, so you're thinking in that kind of time frame. We have a very different time frame from a financial transaction, which might take milliseconds. And we're now moving into a model where we're getting closer. The application timescale and the operational timescale are approaching each other. And that allows for some tremendously interesting and very, very highly optimized resource utilization. that hasn't been possible so far. And I know, I mean, going back to what Gene was saying earlier, Google, a lot of what they're doing with projects is figuring out how to optimize that resource utilization to a max. And I think there's some very interesting things that will come out of that.
Absolutely. I think there are some people working on mainframes that would take exception to the fact that they're not doing DevOps.
Well, just to correct myself here before I get the wrath of the mainframe community on my head, arguably the mainframe community was the first DevOps community because they were both Dev and Ops in one. So let me not have that lying on my head.
Very smooth, Andrew. Guys, before we take audience questions, and before that, we're going to do just some resource slides for the audience to just gather, and of course, they'll be available to anyone. Any final thoughts on wrapping this up before we go to the general audience questions? Gene, I'm going to ask you first if you'd like.
Oh, no, I guess this has been my area of passion for several years now in terms of really seeing how organizations, increasingly complex organizations, adopt DevOps, and I just think there's no better time to be in the game, whether it's from a technology perspective, a leadership perspective, a technical practices perspective. So, man, it's like if you love solving problems, this is the place to be, and I think that's you know, it certainly beats the other way, right, where all the problems have been solved and there's nothing to do. So,
certainly does. Gene, hard question for you. I feel like I'm talking to a politician. Will you run or not? When are we going to see the book?
It'll be later this year. More than that, I don't know. But the big handoff, handoff to editors is happening like tomorrow or the day after that. I'm so excited.
Congratulations. We are too. Can't wait to see it. Topo, what about you?
Yeah, I'll echo Gene's comment that if you have to, if you want to solve problems, then this may be one of the areas that can give you enough opportunity, because there will be problems every day. Just because you brought down your build time from 2 days to 10 minutes doesn't mean that it cannot go to 2 minutes. So there is always be something to solve. So this is an exciting area, and enterprises who are thinking of coming on board, please do not hesitate. And I think Gene is helping creating a good community around DevOps practices for enterprises to share their experience in getting onto DevOps and what they learn. And we'll see you in DOS 16 later this year.
Excellent. Andrew.
I've been talking a lot. Just a quick couple of thoughts then from me. Obviously, yes, also see you there. Very much looking forward to that. The DevOps community is a very welcoming and open community. So I think that you ask around, ask for help. There's a lot of stuff out there. It's not an ivory tower bunch. So there's really help out there. And I think that's the great thing, as Gene was saying. We are now seeing that it is possible to do this even if you haven't built your organization from scratch around this. You can do this in an organization that started at a different place, which it's the case for like 95% of the organizations out there. They didn't grow up with this, which is what the unicorns did. And it's possible to move there. And that's what's so mind-blowing, that you didn't, exactly. This didn't have to be in your DNA to start with. We can introduce it. So go make it happen.
Excellent. Guys, before we go to audience questions, just quickly, first slide right up here now is from our friends at Xebia, who were kind enough to sponsor today's webinar. And not to worry, the slides are going to be available to everyone. You don't have to jot everything down here. But here are some great resources for your journey. And more great resources and wanting to learn more. This is from Gene.
By the way, so if you want specifically what might be interesting to you might be the link to all the videos and slides from DevOps Enterprise Summit 2014 and 15, and announcements for the upcoming DevOps Handbook. All you have to do is send an email to realgenekim@sendyourslides.com with subject line DevOps, and you'll get an automated response within a minute or two.
There are some great videos there too.
Thank you, Alan, for all the interviews you did. You did like 60 of them. That was amazing.
About 80, but who's counting? It was a lot. It was a lot of fun, though, Gene. And all right, We do actually have a bunch of questions from the audience, and as usual, not enough time for them all, but we will do our best, and we'll submit questions to all three of you. If anyone questions that we don't get to online today, if you find any interesting, you'd like to do a written response, that's great. We'll post those as well. Let me get to some of these questions though. So the first one I wanted to bring up was we briefly touched, I think it was Andrew touched on open source, or maybe it was Topo. But do you think that open source tools are prepared to handle the heavily controlled regulated development organizations, such as those that need for detailed auditability and traceability? I can't think of a better person to answer that question than you, Topo, coming from a bank.
So yes and no. There are enough tools that can give you the start, but there are some great tools that are available in the open source market but can be sold as commercial, under commercial licensing. You can take a look at those tools too. But again, I would like to go back to make this case of really understanding what the enterprise need in terms of audit and compliance. You need to really ask your organization what is exactly needed, because as I said, some of them are really not really requirements, they're just myths. So unless you understand that, there is no point looking at any tools, and it may as well be once you actually look at those sets of requirements and ask the question and find a shorter list, then maybe some of the open source tools that are available today can meet your need.
Excellent. Gene or Andrew, any comment on that? No? I think Topo
yeah,
had
no,
it.
I just agree with what Topo was saying.
Yeah.
Cool.
So here's one, and this is actually one I've heard a few times, and Gene, I think I've actually heard you answer this, but what sort of metrics and measurements do you use to define success and wins at DevOps at the enterprise scale?
Oh, for the last 3 years, we've used really 4 metrics to define, based on the clustering of what dictates success. The first one is deployment lead time. How quickly can you go from code committed to running in production? The third is, the second is deployment frequency. How quickly do you deploy? Third is the stability metrics, right? It's change success rate and mean time to repair. And I would say of all the things to focus on, it really should be deployment lead time. In other words, let's focus on making it easy as possible to do deployments without causing errors. And that really does seem to validate and confirm a long-held belief in the lean community that lead time is the most accurate predictor of internal quality, customer satisfaction, and even employee happiness. So if you go to the slides link in the send your slides thing, you can see a whole presentation on that. So I would say lead time, from code committed to running in production.
Fair enough. Topo or Andrew, any comments on that?
No, I agree, and actually, Gene, back to your comments about lead time. I think that's an awesome measurement. At some point, people are measuring number of deployments done, but then you mentioned that in your one of your speeches, you mentioned that the total number of deployments per day may be a wrong thing to judge, because as you increase number of developers, your number of deployments will go up. So maybe a more normalized data is number of deployments per developer. I kind of like that idea too.
Excellent.
Yeah, and just maybe one final point, another dimension that's worth thinking about at any rate, we've had this discussion a few times with users of ours, is if you try to relate the number of features you're releasing to the number of commits that are going to production, because of course it's not always the case that every commit does something that's useful from a business perspective, right? It does something, of course. Ultimately, it's about delivering business value, not arbitrary code. So, how many of those features that you had on your backlog or whatever can you ship, and how well do they do?
Great. All right, another question, and this one again I think we kind of touched on. What is your opinion of the whole bimodal IT argument vis-a-vis DevOps adoption? Also, some analysts are using, well, let's start right there. Bimodal IT vis-a-vis DevOps adoption. Topo?
I do not know exactly what that means, so to speak. So what I'm going to paraphrase that question to say that DevOps in all lines of businesses, in all kinds of applications, is not going to be the same. It's going to be different if it is a Java-based application versus it is mainframe-based. So you have to accept that, and I think you have to plan according to that and design your delivery pipeline according to that. Otherwise, if you try the other way, it will be a disaster. And if you try to deploy mainframe applications 10 times a day, it will be a bigger disaster.
So Topo, let me try to frame it in my simpleton terms of how I view that question, and I've heard this from other people. So there's almost this theory of bimodal IT where you have sort of separate but equal, right? Teams running in parallel but at different speeds doing different things, and never the twain shall meet, right? And it's okay to do that. Versus, to me, more of what I call a Swiss watch model, where you have big gears and little gears, and they spin at different speeds, but they all work in precision.
Yeah.
And to me, DevOps is more of a Swiss watch than parallel teams. And Gene, Andrew, feel free to jump in on that as well if you'd like.
After you, Gene. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I just go back a little bit to the bimodal IT. It's such a great way to think about it. Yeah, I think some people react very violently towards it, right? Saying that, like Scott Prue from CSG, the largest bill printing company in the U.S., he would say, the way systems are coupled together, there really is not a slow IT, right? Like eventually, you make enough changes on the front end, you're going to touch back-end systems of record. So I think that's very persuasive. But I think the only way that you can keep people from just freaking out, saying that everybody has to be doing multiple deployments per day to give them an out. But I think ultimately most people will have the realization that this whole value chain you need to speed up in order to achieve business goals. So, but we can tell them that later.
Yeah, I think Topo put it exactly right in saying that different types of technologies will move at different speeds, and that's totally okay. Gene said the same thing. I think, this is not the way bimodal IT is intended to be interpreted, but I've certainly had discussions where people look at it as a recipe for saying, well, we won't care about the old boring stuff that we have. We're just going to focus all the smart people on the new cool stuff that we have and let them play with Docker or whatever the latest shiny happens to be. And I think as Topo, that's it's intrinsically, technically just inaccurate to assume that you can speed up just a little bit, like the cool stuff, and then the other stuff, well, that'll just keep running. As Gene was saying, these systems all touch each other at some point. And yes, you have to recognize that they're different, and you have to apply different metrics to them and then think in their own terms, if you like. But none of them is sort of given a free pass of, like, we're not going to innovate here just because it's running on an older system or something like that.
Yep. Let me ask the second part of this question, because we're running a little low on time. And this is something that I just find stinging, and I'm interested in your thoughts. Some analysts are using IT failures as examples of DevOps failures, right? And look, just because you're doing DevOps doesn't mean you're guaranteed success. I don't think anyone has ever said that. But it is getting sort of tagged with that. Gene, if you don't mind, I'll throw it to you first. Views?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, it's all biased, right? I mean, you could say that DevOps Enterprise has a very high selection bias towards success stories. Others may have a different agenda and choose failures. I think, I think the tool of doing the state of DevOps reports, where that's really a cross-population study, right, with 20,000 respondents over 3 years. Yeah, I think we have a pretty good idea of the health and habits of technology organizations, and we know that there are high performers and there are lower performers, and that high performers significantly outperform the non-high performers. So I think the goal of those type of research instruments are really to neutralize that kind of bias. So I think that that can't be disputed, although you can argue successfully, I think, and it's very valid, that each one of us brings a certain bias, but that's what cross-population studies are designed to do. Yeah, that's the instruments that they use to find that smoking caused cancer, right? So
yeah. Let's not even. Yeah, I was going to go climate change, but I'm not. Topo, I'm going to let you have the last word on that one, if it's okay, as we reach the top of the hour here. Topo? Oh, I think we might have just lost. Oh, he's back.
Oh. Topo, question for you.
You know what, I think maybe Topo didn't hear the last one. You might have been on and off. Andrew, what about you?
Yeah, I think, again, I think Gene is absolutely right. Like, you can pick enough success or failure stories to match your particular agenda, so that's why we don't do research based on anecdotal evidence. Of course, there are cases where people have started a project that they call DevOps, and then it blew up, and then that you can label that as a DevOps failure if you like to do that particularly. I mean, I think it's the biggest thing to bear in mind here is that it's not as though the state of IT is perfect. So once we agree that IT is not can radically be improved, I think the responsibility of all of us as professionals in IT and as professionals in the business is to figure out what's to the best of our current knowledge, the ways in which we can improve where we currently are at. And I think DevOps and continuous delivery in these things, to a large extent, is just a collection of the latest and greatest learning, and that doesn't make it perfect, and that doesn't mean it'll always work, but it's the best thing we've tried so far. So we should try doing that.
Excellent way to end, Andrew. Thank you. Guys, it's 3:01 or 3:01 in my time zone, so we're going to need to end it. Gene Kim, it's always a pleasure to have you on one of our webinars. Good luck, and we're really looking forward to the book. Topo Paul, thank you so much. We'd love to have you on more webinars at DevOps.com and look forward to seeing you at conferences. Continued success at Capital One. And Andrew, of course, you're always a breath of fresh air on these, and thanks very much to XebiaLabs for sponsoring. We're going to wrap it at that. This is Alan Schimmel, Editor-in-Chief of DevOps.com. Thank you very much for XebiaLabs for sponsoring today's webinar. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you at a future webinar. Have a great day, everyone.